Dismissing the Field of Clinical Psychology. Preface. Recently, I got into an argument with a psychopath. This resulted in me first being mobbed and then community mobbed. I had no idea that something that messed up could actually exist. Unlike most victims, I'm very intelligent, so I can actually see what's going on, and I will give you the full explanation. I'm passing the knowledge on in the hope that if people can understand what is going on and they can stop it. So why is the title Dismissing the Field of Clinical Psychology? Really simple. I looked into the history of other people who had got into the argument with the same psychopath, and they were all diagnosed with psychosis of some variety. I don't think this is wrong either. After going through all the literature on community mobbing and psychosis, one of the things I determined quite quickly is that are almost certainly the exact same thing. You might naively think so community mobbing is just psychosis. Unfortunately no, it would be slightly more correct to say that psychosis is community mobbing. Also, if you read the literature on the persecution of witchcraft and compare it with the literature on community mobbing, they match almost perfectly. What's going on is both a social and psychological phenomena, and it is unsurprisingly complicated. But it can be both explained and proven, and I'm willing to do just that. A very simple explanation is to just explain the differences between witchcraft, something you are aware about, and community mobbing. The differences are surprisingly few. As you will find in the literature on community mobbing, the victim knows that it began when they pissed off either a psychopath or some organization, usually by filing a complaint. This is exactly the same as in witchcraft. People were accused of being witches for annoying someone of a higher social standing than them, not for having magical powers. However, that was the lie that was spread about the witch to prevent them getting help. In the persecution of witchcraft, the community mobbed the person in a very direct physical way. You certainly wouldn't deny that in the persecution of witchcraft that people not out to get the victim. Community mobbing is just an evolved version of this. Instead of attacking the victim in an open physical manner, which would be against the current laws of society in most of the world, it has progressed to attacking the victim in a psychological manner. The lie being spread about the person to prevent them from getting help changed to the person is saying things that are not there. The only other major difference is that in witchcraft, the witches were burned at a stake or otherwise killed in an open fashion. In community mobbing, the victim is locked up and forced to take mind-destroying drugs. Antipsychotics are for all intensive purposes poison. At an average dose, they cause 10% brain matter loss per year. Here is a hint: 10% brain matter loss is serious. However, the use of these drugs are perfectly legal. The difference between actually dead and brain dead isn't much. I should probably cover voice hearing as well. People in the community mobbing community don't understand why they eventually start hearing the voice inside their head. Actually, this is exactly the same as witchcraft. You have probably heard stories of witches confessing to practicing magic with the devil. The devil in this case refers to a voice that the witch hears inside his/her head. In the same way, people in psychosis say they heard the voice of God. The difference between the devil and God is merely a cultural one. The other place voice hearing occurs is in child abuse cases. To put it simply, voice hearing is caused when a person is in any situation where they are threatened in which they can't escape. It's most likely due to overactivation of the brain's fight or flight response. The voice serves an evolutionary purpose of helping to get the person get out of the situation they are in. So if the reader understood witchcraft, the reader would now understand community mobbing and some of psychosis. However, it is unlikely that reader understands witchcraft, so we will explain further. Keep in mind that human nature hasn't changed since the persecution of witchcraft, and in some countries the persecution of witchcraft still goes on. To go any further in understanding witchcraft, psychosis or community mobbing, we need a basic understanding of how human societies actually function. Firstly, if community mobbing was just some kind of mass conspiracy, it would have fallen apart a long time ago. To understand what is going on, you need to understand that humans are the product of evolution and that a human society is an evolutionary system. One of the first properties of all evolutionary systems is that the different segments of the population employ different survival/mating strategies. The quick and very illustrated example of this is that of the common side-blotched lizard. The male population of the common side-blotched lizard is split into three, which are conveniently color-coded. From Wikipedia, orange-throated males are strongest and do not form strong pair bonds. Instead, they fight blue-throated males for their females. Yellow-throated males, however, manage to snatch females away from orange-throated ones for mating. Orange-throated males' large size and aggression are caused by high testosterone production. Blue-throated males are middle-sized and form strong pair bonds. While they are outcompeted by orange-throated males, they can defend against yellow-throated ones. Because blue-throated males produce less testosterone, they are not as large as the orange-throated males, but it gives them the advantage of being less aggressive and able to form strong pair bonds. Yellow-throated males are smallest, and their coloration mimics females. This lets them approach females near orange-throated males and mate when the males are distracted. This is less likely to work with a female that has bonded with a blue-throated male. Humans behave in a similar fashion. To understand the different strategies employed by humans, we can go all the way back to Sigmund Freud on the makeup of the human mind. The human mind is composed out of the idea, ego and superego, and these are the three driving forces that make up the person. The basic description of all three is in order. Idea, this is the base animal instructs of a person. The functions controlled by the idea are roughly greed, sexual desire, aggression, attacking smaller things than us, fear, running away from things bigger than us. The evolutionary need fulfilled by this part is self-serving behavior. Ego, this is a part of the mind that balances desires coming from the idea and superego against what is possible in the society the person is based. It resolves the conflicts between the idea and superego. The evolutionary need fulfilled by this part is being able to interact with other people in the society properly. Superego, this is the moral/ethical part of a person. It contains the person's sense of right versus wrong. The evolutionary need fulfilled by this part is the social behavior, i.e. helping other people with no reward. Evolution cares about the survival of a species as a whole, not just about the survival of individual members. People in childhood establish a balance between their IDs, egos and superegos. However, this balance between all three is not a permanent thing. People can shift naturally towards their ID or their superego. When a person shifts towards their ID, this cuts off the superego, and when the person shifts towards their superego, it cuts off their ID. The person can't therefore be considered to be functioning in one of three states. We will label these states as follows. Ego bias, a person composed out of the idea, ego and superego. ID bias, a person composed out of the idea and ego. Superego bias, a person composed out of an ego and superego. Ego bias will be explained first. All people have at some point in their lives been in the ego bias, so this state doesn't need much explanation. It's a normal person who has both desired from the idea and morals from the superego and balances them in the ego. This can be considered a balance between local interests of the person and global interests of the society the person is in as a whole. Someone who is ego bias naively will believe that all other people are ego bias. This is due to how the human brain models its external environment. The human brain's model of its external world is contained within a neural network. Neural networks function by taking the external information it receives and attempting to create an approximation of it. This goes wrong since people who are ego bias, ID bias and superego bias in normal situations will behave in the exact same manner. So the neural network is initially built using the flawed assumption that all other people are ego biased as well. When opposing information is shown to a neural network, it will only make the smallest possible change to correct for it. Hence this flawed assumption will normally remain with a person who is ego biased except under certain circumstances which will be explained later. This is the balanced state between local behaviors and global behaviors. The next state to explain is ID bias. This is a more disturbing state, however it is very widespread and might even out-dominate the number of people in the ego bias state. The mind of a person in this state does not have any input from the superego and therefore is unable to process moral/ethics. A person in this state is controlled by their ID desires, which are counterbalanced by the ego of what is possible in the society they are in. They are motivated by greed, sexual desires, will behave aggressively to people in weaker positions than them and will flee from people who are stronger than them. They can also display any emotional state as the needs arise. This state is where the locally optimal behaviors take over without consideration for the global optimal behavior. The difference between someone who is ego bias and ID bias is actually quite shocking. I'm going to explain why. If a person who is ID bias has a sexual desire to rape someone, this is balanced against the ego's response of will I get caught? If the answer is no, they are not likely to get caught. They will proceed to rape the person. Their superego is cut off and therefore they cannot rationalize that the action is wrong. In the Milgram experiment, people were instructed by an authority figure to slowly murder a person by administering increasingly higher voltage electric shocks until they reach lethal levels. The person who is ego bias may rationalize that this action is wrong and therefore refuse to apply the lethal shock levels. However, a person who is ID bias, when confronted with this situation, saw that the authority figure was in a higher social position than they were, and so their ID fear response put forward that they must obey the authority figure and must do as told and murder the person. The ego said that it was possible to apply the lethal shock and the superego isn't present. The result of this experiment is that 65% of the population will kill when ordered to do so by a member of higher social standing, and this is one of the main reasons why witchcraft, community mobbing and psychosis can exist. ID bias people will attempt to find other ID bias people and work together as a group to attack/exploit weaker people in the ID bias state or people in the ego bias state. They recognize people in the ego bias state and people in ID bias state but rarely are aware of people in the super bias state. People in the ego bias state who are near a group of people in the ID bias state can't recognize that they are being exploited by people in the ID bias state and will eventually fall ill. This is the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome/myalgic encephalomyelitis, two disorders currently with no known cause. A drop into politics which I would like to avoid, but it does help make this point. The fact that people are either ego bias or ID bias is reflected in modern politics, with its simple split between left-wing and right-wing. This will obviously change depending on country, etc. The policies that appeal to people who are ego bias are different from the policies that appeal to people who are ID bias. You may have read the recent article on how more conservative people appear to have different psychological behavior that respond to fear. That is because their minds are wired to be more affected by the idea and its fear response. The next state to explain is the superego bias. This is an interesting state. The mind is produced by the ego and the superego. The voice heard by a person in witchcraft, community mobbing, psychosis corresponds to a personification of the superego. A person in this state loses their base animal instincts, which means their greed, sexually, aggression and fear response are cut off. Their mind is composed of the conflict between the moral/ethics coming from the superego and what is possible in the society. They perform behavior that is globally optimal for the evolutionary system without necessarily concerning themselves with self-preservation. The evolutionary purpose is multifold. Firstly, their intelligence goes up and they contribute new ideas to the society they are in, pushing the society forward. Secondly, they work to get rid of people acting the idea-biased state so the evolutionary system does not become full of purely self-serving agents which will collapse a society. This state is also counter-evolved against the idea-biased state to allow it to overcome attacks from people in the idea state, and it does this in very interesting ways which are non-obvious. Even though it might seem queer to the reader that there are three states of operation the human mind can run in, from an evolutionary perspective it is very useful. The three modes of operations are co-evolving against each other, creating internal competition, pushing the evolution of the human species forward. This is also, simply speaking, how evolutionary systems work. Next thing to understand is idea bias versus superego bias coevolution. The evolutionary advantages of the idea bias strategy are simple. They work together with other idea bias people to exploit people in the ego state. They can do this because they can display any emotion they desire freely. This allows them to exploit people in the ego bias state who don't possess the ability to display any emotion and therefore assume naturally that other people can't. So what advantages does the superego bias state have over the idea bias behavior? Morals and ethics are fine and all, and they may also be more intelligent than people in the idea state, but that doesn't really allow them to compete. To explain this, we need to explain some of the basic properties of reality and evolution. The human has five senses that they can look into reality and constructs a model of reality that matches what it observes from these five senses. However, even with a basic understanding of classic physics or quantum mechanics, you would know what reality actually is and what it appears to be from a human perspective are very different things altogether. The visible part of reality that can be seen with the five senses lie the tip of the iceberg floating above the sea. Like the iceberg, there is a lot more to reality hidden under the water. While the idea bias state has evolved to effectively exploit the visible parts of reality through mobbing, etc., the superego bias state has needed to compete with multiple people in the idea bias state attacking it, and this has created evolutionary pressure on the superego bias state to exploit the non-visible parts of reality, the parts hidden under the water, so to speak. Obviously, describing things that operate outside of visible reality is outside the scope of this paper. The superego bias state has a whole set of abilities that allow it to defend itself from people in the idea state. These abilities, when seen by people who are ego bias or idea bias, appear as unexplained miracles. This is most likely the source of quite a lot of religions. People who are ego bias getting trapped in situations that rationally have no way out. The flight/flee chemicals build up inside the person's brain. This causes them to hear the voice generated from the superego and witnessing the miracle that removes them from the situation. Belief in God, so to speak, is the belief that against apparent rational logic from people who are idea bias or ego bias that these evolved abilities will save the person. Even in modern societies these abilities do function quite effectively. This is why the superego bias state isn't extinct. These abilities are what the magic in witchcraft refers to. I used to believe that religions had no function in society, however I admit my mistake. The ability to believe in something you aren't able to directly see nor rationalize about can very much save your life. So I'm going to go through the stages of what happens in a typical community mobbing/psychosis to put it all together. You can pull most of this information from the community mobbing community. First thing is the victims annoy someone of high social standing in some way. Falling out with the wrong person, making a complaint about an organization, etc., or is just disliked by someone. The person is first mobbed by the people who are ID biased around them and spread lies to people who are ego biased around them to get the people in the ego biased state to join in on the mobbing. The next step by the mob is to get the person to see a medical professional who is ID biased and taking part. Once that is done, the person can be officially stated to be in psychosis of some description. A professional team of people then takes over from the original mob in mobbing the victim. The general list of things done by the professional team is: elaborate acts involving 20+ people, gaslighting, been shown custom TV programming. In hindsight, it was mostly generic prepared tape PCP/LSD poisoning, abusive threats, sleep deprivation, running multiple stories to cause as much psychological confusion as possible, vehicles driving up to the person and then turning around and going the other way, people dressed like the person, stories. These are the ones used on the personality KGB spy story. Large international corporations secretly run the world. Freemasons secretly run the world. The stories are not supposed to make sense. They are supposed to cause as much disruption as possible to the brain, reevaluating its internal model of reality. I imagine different stories are used depending on the background of the person. They go all out more or less. They would throw the kitchen sink at you, so to speak, if it wasn't bolted down. It is no surprise that some people actually believe that they are seeing things that are not there because they have absolutely no way to interpret what they are seeing in front of them. It is utterly overwhelming, and that is kind of the point. The victims daren't talk about what happened to them because they are afraid that no one will believe them, and most of the victims have no idea what on earth has happened to them. During all this, since the victim is in a situation where they are being constantly threatened and have no available way out, the brain starts to fill up with the fight-flight chemicals. Once it reaches a certain point, the brain releases a chemical cocktail into itself. Part of this is the dopamine. You see a descriptor in clinical psychology as a chemical imbalance. The dopamine has been released for a very good evolutionary reason. The chemical cocktail has several effects. It causes an artificial high, blunting any pain the victim is in. It causes the victim to hear a voice coming from the superego. Under normal circumstances, the model contained by the neural network in a person in the ego state can't have large changes done to it. However, the chemical cocktail allows the basic assumptions made by the neural network to be redone, and the neural network starts to re-evaluate the external reality around it and creates a new internal model of its external world. From the perspective of the person, this takes the form of flashbacks. This also allows the balance between the idea, ego and superego parts of the brain to change. The person can either change to being ID biased or superego biased. The person who is ego biased, simply speaking, can't get out of the situation. The person who is ID biased will attempt to lie their way out of the situation. The person who is superego biased uses the co-evolved abilities to get out of the situation in what appears to be a miracle, normally causing confusion to the people in the ID state mobbing the person, and most likely the person themselves. During this process, when a person suddenly becomes massively ID biased, it causes sexual dysfunction, and when the person suddenly becomes massively superego biased, it causes asexuality. People in the community mobbing community misinterpret the chemical cocktail as being electric harassment, microwave guns, etc. Even though it's completely wrong, the underlying reason why people are saying this does exist. If you want to get out of the situation alive and yourself, it's simply a matter of listening to your superego and working together with it. You basically just got to go against everything you have ever been taught and think is rational, and listen to the voice inside your head. It works. You just need some faith in evolutionary forces, or for the religiously God. I think in Christianity the term is guardian angel. You could also leave the situation in the ID biased state, but you wouldn't really be you, and whether you would be self-aware in the same way is questionable. You might still get mangled, so to speak, since even though you're the same as the people mobbing you, you are of lower social status. Other things that happen to the victims: suicide. There is a study talking about people committing suicide after being mobbing at work. They just don't mention the follow-up: community mobbing, brain death by antipsychotics/antidepressants, shooting sprees. Quite a lot of people make the simple assertion that even though they have no understanding of what on earth is going on, The people who mobbed them at work/school, etc. are clearly responsible and then attempt to get revenge on the original mob by taking them down with the person. This is what has really happened when you hear claims of a person with a history of mental illness doing a shooting spree. The classic example is the U.S. Postal Service with people going postal. This is not because the U.S. Postal Service is a stressful working environment. This is because the U.S. Postal Service is highly ID biased and they mob and get rid of people who join who are in the ego bias state. So let's move on to clinical psychology. The first thing I'm purposing is that psychosis and all its variants, schizophrenia, manic depression, depression and catatonic, are the same thing. They are just the different ways people react to being community mobbed. I'm also claiming that psychosis is not caused by stress or illicit drugs. It is no different from claiming that hysteria is caused by a woman's wandering womb. Psychotic hallucinations are a combination of gaslight mobbing, where a mob of people around a person claim not to see something that is there, or vice versa, and LSD-induced. Psychotic delusions are caused by the stories done during community mobbing to confuse the victim. That should be pointed out that none of these conditions have any physical symptoms. There is a claim about brain matter loss. However, if you read recent research studies, you will find that the amount of brain matter loss is directly dependent on the amount of antipsychotics taken by the person. Bipolar disorder/manic depression. Firstly, it is interesting that the name is being changed from manic depression to bipolar disorder. Manic depression is more accurate. The depression comes from the severe psychological abuse coming from the community mobbing. The mania comes from the chemical cocktail being released by the brain due to the prolonged fight or flight situation. Depression, same as bipolar disorder/manic depression, but without the induced chemical high. Schizophrenia, again, the same as bipolar disorder/manic depression. Probability slightly higher levels of the released brain chemicals. The person might have started to work out what is happening around them. That claim food poisoning is real. Normally they test positive for phencyclidine (PCP). There are papers on how PCP causes symptoms identical to paranoid schizophrenia. This is, however, the error of causation. It is indeed true that there are a lot of people in paranoid schizophrenia with PCP in their systems. However, PCP in itself can't not cause the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. The other drug used is LSD, and I think I can't top this off with turning the classic statement, "All the people around me have been replaced by clones including me," into a more rational sounding statement. The reason people say this is because they have returned to their families. Their families being mostly in the ID bias state. Against what someone was ego bias would expect, their families see the community mob as something bigger than them and therefore bow down to the community mob and join in with the mobbing themselves. This of course goes directly against what someone who was ego bias would expect to happen, who would normally expect their families to defend them. It's not likely. I again refer you to the Milgram experiments. The person who is ego-biased would not expect people in their family would kill someone if ordered to. However, 65% of the population does. That is the "all the people around me have been replaced by clones" part. Including me just means the person is either in the ID biased state or the super ego biased state. This isn't unique to schizophrenia either. You will find similar information if you research abusive relationships, in that the abused person will attempt to go back to their family who will join in on the abuse, because the abuser has higher social standing than the family. Catatonic, simply speaking, it's severe shock. The main points of clinical psychology is to try to force people into being either ID bias or alternatively make them brain dead. Additionally, it functions to suppress the information that there is more than one state that people operate in, which allows people who are ID bias to exploit people who are ego bias more effectively. It's a lot easier for people in the ego-biased state to believe there is some kind of disorder that causes people to believe that there is more than one type of person because it's a smaller change to their internal model of reality. Medication-wise, I'm completely unqualified to give any advice. However, it is generally advised to take complex B vitamins, and once you have removed yourself from the situations, a small amount of MDMA can remove the shock. I've taken 2 pills of the stuff. It does work. I'm not advising you start a drug addiction, however. And yes, I have never used any illicit drugs before the community mobbing. Some other interesting bits. You might have wondered how the CIA intended to use LSD as a truth drug. If you can't convince the person that they are going insane, it is a lot more easier to extract information from them. I don't want to go to political about this, to be honest. If you have seen the news article about the mentally ill terrorists in Guantanamo Bay with the PCP and LSD being ordered for advanced integration, you might have naively believed that these are unrelated things. Nope, the PCP and LSD was ordered because that is how schizophrenia is done. So the next question is, why hasn't this come out earlier? Well, people have been trying to leak parts of this information in various ways. I couldn't have worked this all out by myself. Don't give me too much credit, I'm just putting all the available information together. Witchcraft and psychosis being the same thing, for example, is widely known. Where or not how to prove it is widely known is of course a different question altogether. What about scientific research? Shouldn't someone have found out about this? Perhaps someone who was doing a PhD in neuroscience, with a research topic around the lines of a biological basis of psychiatric and neurological disorders. With a background in neural networks, might accidentally discover this. Go ask James Holmes how that worked out for him. Even if you don't believe me, at some point during your life you might get community mobbed yourself, and this information will seriously help you. Also, some advice on defeating the system, as it's called. You defeat the system by destroying all of its control mechanisms. In the so-called free world, the system has 2 control mechanisms. The first is clinical psychology. It's completely fraudulent and allows people who are ID biased to kidnap people. Most of its so-called cures work by causing serious brain damage and amnesia. The second is the police force. You might be aware that the police force does IQ tests on people who enter it and prevents anyone of too high of IQ from joining. The reason this is the case is that people who are ID biased have much lower IQ than people in the ego or superego state. You just need to get people who are ego bias or superego bias into the police forces. What could actually do with is having the minimal IQ requirement for joining the police force, and therefore pushing the ID bias people out of the police force. That's all there is to it, to be honest. Now, the trivial bit: how to show what I'm saying is true and what clinical psychology is saying is false. All that needs to be done is to look at the global properties of clinical psychology. Psychosis is the only condition where first world countries are worse at curing than second world countries. This is because first world countries have better resources for the mobbing, and clinical psychology is there for making the condition worse, not better. You might be aware of the blotting techniques for detecting mental illness, and the correct answers being the ones involving sexually. The techniques are basically for separating people who are ID biased, who will describe them as sexual things, from people in the ego state who will describe them as random things. That's how it works. You might also note that clinical psychology doesn't attempt to treat psychopaths or manipulators. This is because psychopaths and manipulators are ID biased like the clinical psychologists themselves. Clinical psychology is purely for prosecuting people who are ego bias or superego bias. There is also the research group, looking into why more intelligence increases the chance of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. This is really simple. People in the ID biased state have lower intelligence and obviously won't be community mobbed, and this skews the numbers. I don't want you believing naively that I have just been the victim of MK Ultra or something like that. It is the complete entirely of clinical psychology. It's every case. Real cases of psychosis, simply speaking, do not exist. I'm also fully aware that other people who have had this happen to them have went on to then write music and stories about it, etc. And I have listened to and read some of them. I'm not an artist. I'm a researcher. What I do is research things. All I can do is explain what is going on and give a whole picture of what's happening. Also, on that note of me being a researcher, please forgive my lack of sites and complete lack of proper formatting. Everything I have referred to can be looked up. I have no idea whether or not putting this all into plain text is actually a good idea, but it's probably better than me doing nothing at all. Additionally, since I've taken the trouble to write all this, I would appreciate if you could copy it and do something useful with it. Perhaps fixing my English at the same time, since I can't exactly get someone to proofread this.